Welcome to the Content Amplified podcast, brought to you by Masset. Our goal is to help you get more from your marketing content. Each episode is a 10 to 15 minute interview with industry experts that share amazing insights to help you squeeze as much juice from your content as you possibly can. Here's today's interview.
Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by Margaret. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. So before we dive into the subject, Margaret, maybe if you could just share for 1 or 2 minutes a little bit about your background, what you love about marketing, some of your experience, just to set the stage today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a weird post-college start into my marketing background. I had a couple false starts of some careers. I was a portrait photographer. I worked in hospitality PR in Miami, which was wild. And then eventually I found my way early into a company called Envision, which is design collaboration software, as a content marketer. It was kind of overlapping my love of storytelling, my PR approach, and I was really excited by the idea that I didn't have to pitch a journalist to tell the story. I could just write the story and publish it on a blog. That felt very fun to me. So the space was really amazing. I got to work with a lot of designers and I got to write about creativity and get into their brains, which was really, really fun. So I was there for several years and watched kind of a meteoric rise about Series A to Series E, I think I was there for. So they grew really fast. We were fully remote before remote was cool. And then I moved over to a company called AppQs here in Boston, which helped in product experiences and companies become more product-led. I was there for a couple years leading their content and brand program, and then moved over to the VC world at a firm called OpenView, and was there for the last few years before I left about a year ago. And now I'm full-time advising founders and their heads of marketing on marketing strategy.
I love it. That's a great background. I have so many points that I think we can touch on from that. I think there's a lot of good stuff there. So for today's conversation, what we're going to focus on is something that unfortunately almost every single marketer needs to go through. Hopefully you haven't had to, but odds are you will at some point in your career. And really it's explaining and pitching your content program to your executive team. And the first couple questions to kind of kick this off: why should you have to do that? I think for some early marketers, it's probably something they're not aware of. But why do you need to actually go and convince your executive team that a content program is valuable and what it's going to accomplish? And then really, how do you go about doing that? So what's your approach? How do you kind of tackle this when you're working with executive teams, both for businesses you've worked for or people that you're advising?
I think the first thing to do is to try to remove as much marketing jargon from your vocabulary as possible once you get to that executive level. So we as marketers are oftentimes talking to other marketers on our team, and maybe our even manager is a marketer. But once you get up to that executive level, folks are not thinking about marketing all the time. And if anything, they've maybe heard terms at different organizations and they mean different things to them than they might mean to you. So the first step is, can you remove as much marketing jargon as possible when you talk to your leadership team? I think anytime that you're trying to make a good pitch to anyone really, but especially to an executive team, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, you have to start at the last thing that you both agree on, and then you can scaffold your argument from there. I think a lot of times people try to start with the first thing that you disagree on and start to get people to move over from there. If anything, if you can start a couple rungs up and get people to say yes a couple times, it's even easier to bring them down your thought train. But definitely at least start in the last thing that you both agree with. The thing that I see most people do is that they have to align the executive team on what marketing actually is a lot of times. And so a framework that I use with every founder that I ever talk to is to define marketing as essentially 2 functions. The first is, can you saturate channels that your target audience lives in frequently and consistently with a message that resonates? Some people, us marketers, might call that brand, but we don't want to use shorthand words, right? We want to say we're saturating channels consistently, frequently with a message that resonates, and obviously channels that your target audience lives in. And then the second piece of marketing is, can you identify signals of readiness, and can we get those people to do the thing that we want them to do? If it's a PLG motion, can we get into the product? If it's a sales-led motion, can we get them to talk to sales? If it's already a customer, can we get them to renew? Can we get them to upsell, right? And so that's essentially the second function of marketing. And with an executive team, we can obviously go back to the budget and decide what percentage of money we're spending on each of those two activities or each of those two programs. But we have to align at the executive level that marketing is both of those things, because content oftentimes sits in that first bucket that we as marketers would call brand, but it's really channel saturation. And that has to be goaled differently from conversion. You might find that there's some pieces of your content or some content programs that are really great at conversion, but ideally a well-established content program is going to do that first piece of just channel saturation as well to help build that affinity and awareness.
So when you're looking at it, how do you typically report on channel saturation when you're looking at it? I mean, obviously, and by the way, just to take one step back, this is one of the best definitions I've ever heard of marketing. And I think it rings so true, not just with content programs, but the entirety of your marketing team for so many reasons. But one of those things, I know the immediate question, if I'm going to an executive team saying, okay, cool. Number one, saturate channels. Number two, identify signals and get them to do what we want. Number two, they're going to say, okay, cool. You're going to show me conversion rates and you're going to show me leads and all that kind of stuff. How are you going to show me number one? What's your typical response to that? And how do you answer that question?
There's an over-reliance on spreadsheets right now for marketing, right? Like spreadsheets are great for that second half of marketing to report on the ROI. You're probably not going to be able to report on it in such a beautiful spreadsheet, and that's going to make your CFO angry, right? They're gonna be a little bothered by the idea that it's not as clean. So there's a lagging indicator, but an important one, that all of your branded search terms, whether it's the name of your company or any other proprietary things that if you're trying to create a category and all those things, those should rise as you start to invest in channel saturation. But you should goal on it in terms of we are fully aligned at the executive level who our target audience is. That gets missed sometimes. We are hyper-focused and understand exactly who our target audience is. We've done the research to make sure we understand how they consume information. If they go to G2 Crowd before they buy a product, then that's a channel that we need to be saturating, right? That's a program that we need to invest in. If they're always on LinkedIn, if they really love to read the New York Times, whatever it is, we understand enough about our target audience that we at executive level agree on the channels in which we will be saturating. And then you're really goaling on frequency and consistency. And you're probably experimenting on the message that resonates, especially if you're an early stage company. But once you see enough signal that that message is resonating, especially in social channels, it's easier to do because you can see if people are hopping into the conversation or they're commenting or the reach and all that good stuff. But once you understand and then bring that back at an executive level and say, this is the message that's resonating, this is the one we're going to go all in on, those things are aligned on. And so it's really you're measuring frequency, consistency, and then also over time, the lagging indicator of an increase in branded search terms.
One thing that's also interesting for me, I love storytelling. I'm a little weird that way. I just read all the time, and that's the way my brain thinks and everything like that. One opportunity that I've seen in the past is to tell a story when you're going to the executive team. If, for example, if you're trying to prove this point and the executive team is, well, how are we going to measure that? Literally, you can throw that back to them and say, okay, I want you to think about the last time you were buying a product in this specific category. What were the top 3 brands that you looked into? You know, whether it's the last time you bought a car or bought a house or whatever, or, you know, even a toothbrush or a pencil or whatever, you know, literally kind of walking them through the buyer's journey again, saying, well, how did you know that they sold that? When you looked into it, oh, you saw advertisements or you were in a channel that they identified and they knew that you were there. You know, you flip it on them for what they're a consumer of, because sometimes we distance ourselves, you know, from the buyer's journey of our target market versus the buyer's journey that we go through. It's all the same. It's just different products and industries. So I think that there's a lot of cool opportunities there.
And I think a lot about that in terms of like, especially, I think a lot about B2B. And so it's like when, especially in B2B, people think that we have a completely different buying experience. But essentially, when you're bringing a product into an organization, you are virtue signaling the same way that when you buy different consumer products, right? Does this make me look like I am really conscious of budget? So I'm going to bring in a cheap solution that's high quality, but I did the research to find somebody a little sneaky that's up and coming. is this solution make me look cool, right? Does this solution make me look like I'm ahead of the game? I'm like, all of those things are also signals that we as human beings use. And B2B companies, I think, forget about that a lot, that you can brand yourself as something that then your target audience feels good about bringing you into the organization because it virtue signals something about themselves.
Yeah, I love that. It was interesting at a previous company of mine. We actually had it outside, someone come in and consult with us, and they went and asked our customers and said, if you could put this company that you're working with, if you put them as a car, if they suddenly turn into a car, what kind of car would they be? And it was interesting because like the executive team thought, oh, we're like the Teslas or the whatever of this space. Turned out we were like the Toyotas, and it wasn't a bad thing. It was reliable, it was efficient, it was effective, it was affordable. Those kinds of things instead of like the bleeding edge kind of a concept.
Yeah, industry leading and cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. I think there's some interesting ways to kind of translate, because it's true, we're very familiar with B2C purchases as individuals. And to translate the B2B experience into B2C often helps you convince people kind of how to do that. So one final question. So you've got the buy-in from the team, you've got them excited, but there's that one grouchy executive in the corner who has the title of CFO. When you talk to them specifically and you're saying, by the way, I need money, how do you approach that conversation? What are some tips to have that conversation go well? And how should you really prepare for that conversation? Because it will happen. Because you can get everyone on board, but you're going to go sit one-on-one with that individual and say, I need money. How do you approach that?
I think overall, and especially with the CFO, you have to understand the language that they speak the same way that you're going to be thinking about your target audience and the language and words that they speak and what they use and what they care about and the channels that they live in and how they like to be communicated with and what message resonates with them. You have to do the same thing for your CFO. So there's a range of CFOs, right? There's some that really understand this brand saturation thing and are totally fine investing a certain portion into it without seeing the conversion ROI that the second piece of marketing is for. There's also ones that don't have a working understanding at all of marketing and just see it as a cost center. So I think first you have to understand where on the spectrum that your CFO lives. Are they viewing marketing just as a cost center? Or are they viewing it kind of holistically as a growth lever? Have they experienced bad marketers in the past that have really burned a lot of money and that they're coming in with a severe level of distrust where you have to rebuild and maybe ask for less money and show some proof points and get people excited, right? Like there's a way to do, especially every content program, there's a way to do it at this point in time, pretty small and scrappy, to start to generate enough signal points that you can then ask for more money. But it totally depends on where your CFO lives on that spectrum. And then you have to understand, like, yes, they might want spreadsheets, right? So you might have to figure out how to get some of this less logical side of marketing, the more emotional side of marketing. Maybe understand it, maybe see what some of the other spreadsheets that they get reported on, right? Or that they have reports sent up to them and understand how they like it formatted, right? Like these things are just little human being things that we do when we're thinking about marketing for our target audience. We're thinking, would they want this blog post to be formatted? Do they prefer denser text or do they prefer really light bullet points and just really snappy information, right? So the same thing that you do when you're thinking about your target audience and how they like to consume information, you have to do with your CFO. It's difficult because a lot of marketers went into marketing specifically to not go into finance or to not become a CFO. But you have to be curious around what are the words that they use? What are the words they understand? How do they like to consume information? And can you make it as easy as possible for them to understand where you're coming from? So it's an easy yes for them. And it might be that you have to take it a little bit step by step and ask for a little bit and then be if you give a mouse a cookie marketer.
I love it. And I apologize to CFOs everywhere. Not all of you are grouchy, but honestly, grouchiness in a CFO is actually a good trait. I've seen many bad decisions be avoided because the CFO was like, that doesn't fly. But
I think of people too as I specifically think of marketers on the spectrum of shipper and polisher, but you can kind of extrapolate it out to like even more folks than just marketers. And the idea is like that polishers want to like really analyze and get everything perfect before it ever sees the light of day, and shippers are like, it can be crap. I'm going to throw it over the wall and see if it sticks. And ideally, what you're seeing is like, especially on a marketing team, like a healthy balance of people that are never on the extreme, but like a little bit in the middle, so they can create that healthy tension. But you can think of that too. Like a marketer is probably going to be like a shipper, like give me the money, let me do it. And the CFO gets to be a little bit of a polisher, like give me a better idea, right? Give me a little bit more trust and assurance. And I think the healthy tension there is the reason why CMOs aren't CFOs, right? Like the whole thing has to work together in this tension of balance. A CFO can slow you down a little bit because maybe your idea really isn't that great. And I think that's the other piece too, is that yes, you can be very invested in your idea, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to do the work to back up why it's a great idea. And it's not a personal affront to you. It's just part of the work is to be able to pitch that up and get people on board. Like that's the leadership level of marketing that is a really tough thing to grow into, to say like, it's actually part of my daily job to make sure everyone's bought into the work that I'm doing here, not just my daily job is to do the work here.
Yeah, I love that. And as an individual who wants to be a high performer, you almost want to crave those conversations. You want that feedback and you want that polishing before it ever goes into the wild, because that's going to make the results better. That's going to make you actually perform and hit the overall objectives and think about things you haven't thought before. I think that's great. Before the podcast, you had this really cool idea when you and someone else aren't on common ground, or if you disagree and you need to actually come to an agreement to move forward with something, you have a really cool way of looking at that and saying, okay, where do we take this? And then how do we build on it? Could you maybe just describe, let's say it's either the CFO or someone on the executive team, you're not quite seeing eye to eye on something. How do you work out the differences with them specifically to move forward?
So I think one of the best things to do when you're trying to get somebody to follow along or convince somebody in your own logic tree is that you have to start first from the last place that you both agree with. So setting that understanding where your executive team and you align. Is it on cultural values? Is it on OKRs? Is it on 3-year strategy that the executive level has put in place? Like, get to that last thing that you both agree on, ideally even a couple more. If you can get somebody to say 3 yeses to agree with you 3 times, it's much easier for you to convince them. I think there's a study on that, but it's always in my head of like, get 3 yeses and then you can bring somebody down your logic tree. But at least start, if you can't get the 3 up, at least start the first thing that you both agree with. And then you can bring them down your own path, your own argument, your own proposal in a way that makes their brain feel a little less frictionful. Most people will start with the first thing that they disagree on. And that's just people, their brains break, right? There's no feeling of community. It's just like, it feels like a combat zone because you're both starting from disagreement, rather than if you can start from agreement, then you can even decide if your departure from that logic tree is the right lane to go down. They could say, oh, I actually have this piece of data that you don't have that brings me down this direction. And that's a really useful place to have a discussion so that you're not wasting your time trying to build programs or proposals for things that actually don't make sense for the business.
I love it. That's fantastic. If someone wants to connect with you, Margaret, and further the conversation or needs help at all, how can they connect with you? What's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, I'm super active on LinkedIn. That's probably the best channel. Connect with me. Feel free to send me a DM if you want to chat. I love taking calls. Every week I take, I'd say 1 to 3 calls just from folks in the industry that want to chat about marketing stuff. So don't be shy and excited to meet folks and continuing. Now I think that I'm advising and I don't have a in-house seat. I like to keep my temperature on the pulse of what's happening by chatting with people who are actually doing the work. So
love it. I love it. Awesome. Well, again, thanks for the time. Appreciate you being on the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Content Amplified podcast. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And for additional ways to get more out of your content, visit our website at getmasset.com. That's getmasset.com. And tune in next time to the Content Amplified podcast.